Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats. I'm your host, Mike Luke, with John Schuster. All right, we talked about DeAndre Ayton and the Phoenix Suns. Let's give a little bit of kudos to Steve Kerr here. Now, a lot of people said early on, anybody could have won with that team. Well, evidently not, because Mark Jackson didn't win with that team. So we'll start at that front. You've watched the Warrior. You know a couple people when you watch the Warriors right now, because we're going to talk about this year's team in a little bit, but what makes Steve Kerr a unique coach in your opinion, John Schuster?
Well, I think the thing that you've got to deal with at this level, I think, the NBA maybe more so than other levels. That may be also an inaccurate statement, but it feels like you've got to cultivate a lot of egos in the NBA. Right. And that's a lot of the job that you're doing. You have to work to convince people who like the idea of being in the spotlight that it's better to function for a greater whole in effort to in essence to succeed at the level that you ultimately want to. And I think Kerr's done a very good job of that balancing act. And that, I guess, to a large degree anymore, and you would know more about this than I do, and I guess you see it to some degree in the professional level of the NBA. Scouting seems to be fairly limited. In terms of game one and game two, and then the way the series ultimately goes. We saw this a little bit, I think, more glaringly for folks who are watching the Suns and the Pelicans series. How do you try to make adjustments between game one and game two? But after those adjustments were made, then what does the better team ultimately do? And more often than not, the better team's going to win in the course of a 7-game series. The NBA is more predictable in that regard, where the better team wins, I think, than other sports, because it's so high scoring and the series are...
And it's a 7-game proposition, yeah.
Yeah, whereas in the NHL, in a 7-game proposition, it's low scoring. You can have a hot goaltender. In Major League Baseball, you can have hot pitchers or two hot pitchers. In football, you've got a 1-game situation. And obviously, at the lesser basketball level in college, you have the 1-game NCAA tournament where anything can happen. But the NBA is the one sport that has a lot of high scoring, which cuts into your margin of error a little bit, and you have 7-game series, so the better team usually prevails. I think more often than not, that's the reason why that is. So scouting itself is limited. You figure out how a team's going to attack you. You can get through that in one game. And then once that game is done, usually the better team comes through. So the more important thing to be able to do, I think, is ultimately you're cultivating egos and figuring out how you can get the most out of whatever your lineup ultimately is. And then from there, talent takes care of itself. But it is interesting. You can make some interesting arguments here. And again, we're still in round 2. So maybe Golden State's going to fall into this just like Brooklyn did, and Philly might, and any of these others, the Lakers not even getting to the playoffs, these other super teams that clearly did not have super seasons. Right. We look at the Warriors a little bit different, but maybe we're doing that just in the now. If the Warriors don't win at all, maybe that conversation is just they made it a little bit farther than some of the other attempts at super teams.
I think what's unique about it, though, is that this is a team now that you lost Kevin Durant, obviously, to the Nets. Excuse me. They've struggled, obviously, moving on. But what they do, everybody in there is pretty much homegrown. And so you lose Kevin Durant, you get a guy, Jordan Poole, in the late first round, who now I think he went for 30 on Sunday. Obviously, Steph was drafted in the franchise. Klay Thompson, Draymond Green. You look around, it's not like they're just kind of, and again, I get that they got Durant, but it's not like they're just picking like superstars from everywhere. It's very much of a self-sustained entity, and that to me is kind of the interesting part. Let's talk about that on the other side. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats with John Schuster. I'm Mike Luke. What do you think about that point there, Shu?
I think that's a really good point, and I think if you look back behind that, go back to one of Steve Kerr's mentors. And Kerr has a lot to do, not everything to do in the franchise, but a lot to do in the franchise. And there are other people there who have understanding of what it is they want, how they want to put it together. But San Antonio was largely homegrown too.
Right.
And those elements work very well. So there is something to be said about that model. What happens after the fact then is that you have very good players who like the idea of playing on teams that are winning. So that you can try to see if that complements a little bit. Sometimes that works. And obviously, as we're seeing to some degree in the Eastern Conference, sometimes it doesn't.
Right. Now, do you think with Steve Kerr, did he strike you as a coach when you were watching him? Did he? I mean, I'm not really surprised he was involved in the NBA, but at the same time, he also, I mean, he was named one of the 15 best coaches of all time. So he's obviously already very highly thought of in that hierarchy.
There was something, I'm going to sidestep the answer. I think the brief answer to that is yes. Many people thought Kerr was going to be excellent in that capacity, that he had an opportunity to succeed in that regard because he wasn't a superstar and he was a smart guy who understood how to deal with superstars.
Right.
So that's a good mix. But based on what you said at the top of the podcast, I thought was kind of interesting. The argument by anybody out there who says that, well, yes, X coach won with incredible talent, therefore anybody could win with incredible talent, would mean that there's no such thing as a good coach ever in the history of the NBA.
Right.
I mean, who are the other 15 great coaches?
Right.
I assume Red Auerbach's on that list. I assume Phil Jackson's on that list.
Who was the coach that didn't win with talent?
Right. So yeah, they based on that logic, they all sucked.
Right.
All of the great coaches in the history of the NBA sucked because none of them were able to win without cultivating the best talent. So it seems to be, and it's an easy argument to make in the here and now. And we, create mythologies for coaches who, were around 40, 50, 60 years ago. But really, the logic is all the same. The Celtics had better players than everybody else. Yeah. For a while, the Lakers had better players than everybody else. The Bulls had a better player than everybody else.
I did hear an interesting. I got an interesting take on this real quick. Real quick, though, if you're going to bet against any of this stuff, what we're saying, you're going to want to go to BetOnline Sportsbook. We've talked about it. That's where you want to be. That's the place. BetOnline Sportsbook. It's been around. It's not going anywhere. If it's good, John Schuster says it's good. I say it's good. Tell him that Locked On Wildcats sent you. Take a quick break. All right, Shu, I got one for you here. Listen to this. Nick, can you name the only team to win multiple NBA titles, within their roster construction that only had one top 75 NBA player?
Top 75 all time?
Mm-hmm. That was named by the NBA.
Miami? Okay, that's all I got.
The Detroit Pistons.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that would have been a good guess. That would have been a good second guess. Honestly, it would have been a good first guess because it would have been right.
It would have been right. And Chuck Daly's looking at you saying, John Schuster, you're trying to diminish my accomplishments right here. I did it with only one top 75 player.
Well, okay. Did he really only have one top 75 player or
I believe Joe Dumars is a top 75 player.
In a given era, let's take that a little bit further. We have, this roster had top 75 players as arbitrarily selected by a bunch of people who created a list.
Right.
Okay. Did they have, in the era when the Pistons won championships, how many of the best players did they have at a given time? 3 out of 20?
Right, for sure. So you've got to go based on the era, for sure.
Right. It's like, well, okay. And what they did at the time, and to Daly's credit, and Daly is an interesting argument here. I think you can certainly, the Pistons utilized the loopholes available to them better than everybody else and created a very good franchise as a result. And other teams have done it in different ways.
But they also messed up the NBA product for a while, though. Can we agree on that?
I don't disagree. Well, I think there's more than just the Pistons, but the Pistons are very high up that list. I think Pat Riley and Mike Fratello had a hell of a lot to do with
sure. For sure.
Bleeping up the look of the NBA as well. In fact, I'm going to try to remember. I think somebody did a documentary recently on maybe Game 7 of the Knicks and the Pistons. It was in this era when I think the Pistons were good, and they were talking about the bad boys, I think. We were in, and it may have been, it was one of the playoffs games, and it was a big deal playoff game, like a Game 7. In the third quarter, the score was something like 42-36. So the entirety of we remember, and I get it, because I remember you don't go to the basket and not pretend to get your ass kicked. If somebody's going to come into the middle, you're going to get hit. You know, you're going to get laid out because you're not going to give up. You're not going to give up crap at the rim. Now, if you look the wrong way at someone at the crap at the rim, in the pendulum overcompensation world of the NBA and every other profession, now you're suspended for 4 games. So I get that we've swung very much in the other way, but the product during that era when the Pistons were winning titles was pretty damn ugly, and the Pistons were the best at being uglier than everybody else.
Speaking of two ugly people, that's John Schuster. I'm Mike Luke. You've been listening to Locked On